Okay, next we have Peter Jones. Peter Jones manages the Lustre support and releases team in the high-performance data division at Intel. He's previously filled similar roles at CFS, Sun, Oracle, and Wham Cloud. He's been the release manager for over 20 Lustre releases. He's the Intel representative on the OpenSFS board of directors. He's also the coach of 2 soccer teams. Ladies and gentlemen, Peter Jones.
Steve. Okay, so hello everybody. I'm going to give a releases update now. I'm going to start just talking about some of the evolutions we've seen recently over the last couple of years in the development community, then give a run through of all the active code releases and then upcoming releases with a particular focus on 2.4 release, which is due out in the near future, and finally just have some closing remarks about release quality. So first of all, I wanted to, this is a slide I actually put together around supercomputing time, and I just wanted to expose it to a broader audience here because I think this actually shows some really interesting, a couple of really interesting points here. So I've been putting data together for some time for the OpenSFS tree contract about contribution levels, measuring them in terms of the number of commits. And I'd always been curious about, because of course the commit itself may be, thousands of lines of code, new feature, or it may be just fixing a typo in a test script. So it's a bit simplistic, although, part of it is the simplicity is part of its beauty, that it's very easy to sort of look at the Git tree and, scroll down and you can pretty much come up with that data yourself. But Andreas helped me by putting together a script that came up with the lines of code changed across all those commits. And we were looking at, gauging how much change was going into our releases, just as a way of, measuring, one of the quality metrics we look at for the releases. And so the key thing here is this lowest line on the chart. So this is the release that never was. So when Oracle suspended development on Lustre 2, right at the tail end of 2010, I guess, there was only 2 blockers left on what was going to be their 2.1 release. And so although this wasn't actually a release per se, it would have been very close to what would have been the 2.1 release. Probably we would have seen another few hundred lines of code, which would have mostly come from Sun Oracle engineers fixing those last couple of blockers, and then that would have been the 2.1 release. So when we took, as a community, 2 years ago at LUG 2011, when talking about the community efforts to complete that release. So, I mean, myself and I think many others, with hindsight, perhaps naively thought that it would be relatively quick to finish off that release and get it to a release level. And as you see, I mean, the actual, so this is, the lower graph is up until the point that things ceased, and then the second 2.1 graph is the, what we actually did as a community for that release. So you can see while it's not quite the same amount, it is fairly significant amounts of effort went into producing that release. And so, I sort of paused and reflected, why is that? And in terms of scope, we did increase the scope slightly because we added Red Hat 6 into the equation, Red Hat 6 support. Red Hat 6 had come out during the time it took us to get organized. And so originally it was out of scope for the Oracle release. We added it in, but really that wasn't the most significant factor. And then I realized that really the key factor was the amount of community testing. So for the work that was happening on 2.1, it was really a continuation from the 2.0 release that had come out in July of that year. It was the same, the same engineering team had just continuing to sort of harden and bug fix on, the release, the initial 2.0, baseline. But they were, obviously using the similar testings and similar hardware for all their testing. Now, so what changed with 2.1 is we had different kinds of testing happening out in the community on different kinds of hardware, running different kinds of data access patterns and all of that feedback coming in, and having bugs that we fixed. And as a result, if the original Oracle 2.1 had gone out, all of those bugs would have been present. But, we had the factor, Livermore definitely were very involved in the testing over that year, really gearing up to roll 2.1 out over their data center. They really wanted to get the 2x baseline hardened ahead of Sequoia. And so we had a lot of issues coming from there. We had, I know Oak Ridge did some testing as well, and Cray, and in particular I did want to mention Cifranet as well. So not such a familiar name perhaps, but Cifranet is a Polish HPC consortium, and they were actually running pre-release versions of 2.1 on their new deployment, which was at the time a top 100 cluster over the year, and provided a number of bits of feedback. So I did see on the attendee list that there are a couple of guys here from Cifranet, so please come say hi at the one of the breaks or something. I'd really like to thank you personally. Anyway, so community testing, and that's something that we've really tried to keep going forward as well, and have the benefits from of continual testing. Having the feedback ahead of the release time means the end result of the release is that much better. And the other thing that's really apparent as well, if you look at the bottom line and compare it to the top line, is just how much more color is on that top line of the 2.3 release. So, this is because we've had increasing diversity in the Lustre development community. So, I think as big as this screen is, it's just not big enough to be able to perceive, but there is actually some third-party development in that lowest 2.1 release, but it's kind of like a pixel thick. It's so small. And then you compare that to all the different colors on the 2.3 release, and there's clearly there's a real shift there. And for me, the key thing there has been out of necessity, as we began that initiative, we dropped the contribution agreements that Sun and Oracle had required, which really was a barrier to entry, in my opinion. And we've had things where someone notices a slight typo, and they can just make that change and get it corrected, and they don't have to go through all this overhead of engaging legal departments to sign documents and what have you. So anyway, moving on, so the consequence of all this diversity is it does bring some extra sort of organizational challenges. So sometimes it's difficult enough having one geographically distributed engineering team, making sure everyone's on the same page and is aware of deadlines and is clear about the agenda. But if you throw into the mix organizational as well as geographical boundaries, then it does sort of increase the complexity and increase the risk of confusion or misunderstandings. So this is where the CWG comes into it. So I'm not going to go into much detail here because Chris Marone is going to have a more detailed presentation later this morning. But basically I did want to emphasize this is a very important forum for us to really sort of swap notes and to coordinate testing and to make sure that we are, those who are most actively involved are aware of things that are happening across our organizations. So going into the releases themselves, so 1.8 is still the most commonly used Lustre code line in production. It's obviously a large factor of this is just the sort of build up over the years of deployments, and people deploy and just leave things alone. So there's that mass there. But even today there's still some new deployments that take place on 1.8 releases. It's just well proven, and if people know that it works well with a given set of hardware, people are just happy just to stick with that and not necessarily there's no real motivator to sort of change that. We did see the CWG did a survey a couple of months ago, and comparing that, so this is the second of those surveys, so we are now in a position where we could look for trends year on year, and there was a definite shift of 2.1 really gaining on 1.8. So still 1.8's in the pole position, but 2.1 was sort of breathing down its neck, basically. And then the other thing with 1.8 is that, to emphasize again, that when Sun released 1.8.0 in May of 2009, at that time it was announced that it would go strictly end of life at June 2012. But we've now with a focus, instead of being on, storage, the focus being on Lustre itself, we've stepped back from that and basically said, as long as there is demand for 1.8 support, we will continue that. So although we're not having regular scheduled releases, we do still have a lot of customers supported sites out there on 1.8 and expect to do so for some time. So we don't have any fixed date that we are going to change that, and obviously it's not going to be an overnight thing. We'll have plenty of advance notice if when that arises. And so yes, earlier this year we did put out a 1.8.9 release. The main driver there is we've been trying to keep 1.8 support with 2.4, so we've been, some changes required for that. And but this we did discuss 1.8 and the ongoing life of it on the CWG, and so the decision was made some time back that 2.4 would be the last release that we would support 1.8 for, interop with 1.8 for, and that that does still give a very long path for anyone who's still currently running 1.8 releases today to sort of hang back and not rush to have to move to 2x, because 2.4 is going to have a long shelf life, and so there will be 2.4 releases available actively to provide an upgrade opportunity for still some years to come. And then finally, I did just include a mention here. Usually on this slide about 1.8, I've had a placeholder thing that just sort of says that Oracle are doing their own 1.8 releases. And I did talk to Nathan Ruttman of Zyrotex about Zyrotex's plans in this arena, and he indicated that because they've assumed support responsibilities for remaining Oracle support customers, they do plan to release a 1.8.8 release at some point, so look out for news from them on that. On to 2.1. This now is increasingly used, Codeline, perhaps the default for new deployments now. Some very large-scale sites running this in production. Livermore, CA, and NASA are all on 2.1 sites across the data center, 2.1 releases across the data center. And we just released back in March 2.1.5, and in the coming weeks we'll put out a 2.1.6 release. But then after then we'll drop into a similar modality as we are with 1.8, that we will just do releases on an ad hoc basis as needed, but not to be on a fixed schedule for those. So just to talk about 2.2 as well, this is a release. This was our first feature release we did post-Oracle, and this came out shortly before LUG last year. It's fairly modestly used, this release. We do have several customers in production on 2.2, but it hasn't been adopted that widely, most people favoring to stick on 2.1 or 1.8. But probably the standout feature, there are a number of features in here, but probably the standout feature was probably imperative recovery, improving the recovery times at larger scales in particular. Moving on to 2.3. So this came out October of last year, and this is actually used quite more extensively, for a newer feature release, given that there aren't going to be maintenance releases following this. This has been adopted reasonably well. I think the largest factor here is SLES 11 SP2 client support. So I did want to extend a thank you to the folk at NASA around this. This was, as part of our ongoing work, we had been landing fixes for the newer kernel support for clients, and we knew that we had the code in for SLES 11 SP2 clients just before we tagged RC1, but it was too late in the day for us to change the test matrix for that release without sort of jeopardizing the scope. So we were sticking with our plan of record to officially support that for 2.4. But NASA had an interest in using that, and so volunteered to be guinea pigs and test that out. So they opened quite a lot of, did a lot of testing and opened a lot of issues, and we were able to separate what were pure test script issues versus actual bugs and provide fixes where needed, and basically come up with a recipe which enabled people to run comfortably in production with SLES 11 SP2 clients on 2.3. So I think that that's probably boosted the numbers here of people who are running 2.3 in production, and I know that we've certainly had a number of other sites who've taken advantage of that option. And in terms of features, probably the standout feature on 2.3 was the Server Stack SMP work, which was funded by OpenSFS, and that basically greatly improves the performance running with larger numbers of cores. And I know that people have, depends of course on the hardware itself, but I have heard some very significant improvements from that work. So moving on to 2.4, so this is scheduled for release at the end of this month, and is going to be the next maintenance stream. So for that reason, and also because all of these releases are cumulative in terms of the features, so now we've got to the point where people are sort of feel there is sufficient reason to want to move forward and to get a hold of these new releases. So definitely, I know of DDN and Cray and Oak Ridge have all been, interested in focusing on this as a release. And then yes, we are dropping testing some of the older clients. When it says SLES 11 clients, that means SLES 11 SP1 clients are dropped. I'm just noticing that now. And we are adding SLES 11 SP2 into the official test matrix and have been testing that option throughout the release cycle. Going on to the features for this release, so we had a feature freeze several months ago, and so we know what content's in there, and we've basically the last few months been continuing to test and check, harden the release and sort of shake out the bugs. And so we've got the 4 megabyte I/O with some work done by Zyratex, and increasing the RPC size there, can have some performance benefits. The ability to disable pinging. This is one of the features that have been upstreamed from Fujitsu. This is development they did under FFS, and that can be advantageous for larger, extremely large numbers of clients, which is something, of course, they've experienced with the K computer. D&E, this is the ability to scale metadata. So again, this is work funded by OpenSFS, and I won't go into any detail here because Wang Di will be talking in more detail about this later on. In fact, I should say with the Fujitsu work as well that Shinji Tsunemoto will be talking about that in more detail as well later in the conference, along with Oleg Droikin. And the network request scheduler, which allows policies to be applied to RPC requests. That's work again done by Zyratex, and Nikitas Angelinas built on some prototype development from Lang Chen of WAMcloud, and has taken that through and productized that. And there were some, I think it was last year's LUG, and maybe even the LAD event in Paris as well. There were presentations on that out there. I was a little surprised there wasn't one for this conference, but I guess you could still refer to that previous information to get the details. There. And then layout lock is a key prerequisite for HSM. And Jin Sang-Xiong will be talking about that in more detail later in the conference. LNet network hashing, again, this is another Fujitsu feature, so it will be covered in that same presentation later in more detail. And single client performance, actually, coincidentally, there was just a very lively discussion on this on HBDD Discuss mailing list just over the last few days. But this has been a bit of a problem area since we moved up from 1.8 to 2x releases, that the new Clio abstraction layer basically really had a negative effect on the client performance of single clients. So larger numbers of clients, there's much better performance, but the specific use case of having a single client wasn't really anticipated as being an issue. So again, Jin Sang-Xiong has done a lot of work in this area because we've had a number of people find that this is something that was important to them. And or even just for, people go to do benchmarking and just do it at a very small scale and then extrapolate that as being the performance, not realizing that it's the actually anomaly in the use case. So even from that, it can actually be a deterrent to people moving forward with Lustre just based on our misunderstanding. But this work, we've had a number of changes landed, and for 2.4, that gap has been greatly reduced, although not altogether eliminated. And so there's still, some further scope, I think, there. And I see that there was a new ticket just opened this morning, which I haven't memorized the number for yet. So, but very, very recently opened ticket by Eric Vogt of NEC, following on from the discussions on the mailing list about some other further work he'd identified here. So we'll no doubt see some further work there going forward. So Wireshark support as well. So Wireshark is a network packet inspection tool, and Doug Altschirek will be presenting about that later in the conference to provide some more detail. And ZFS support was work. This was basically the development work that took place around the Sequoia deployment, and so Chris Marone of Livermore will be talking about that in more detail. And although ZFS was the headline aspect of that, the implications of this work are it really makes things much easier to add alternative back-end file systems. So there could be other possibilities there moving forward. Right. So here's some provisional data about contributions. So this is the more traditional number of commits data. And then if we go forward, there's the data based on lines of code changed. So you can, if you compare the two, you can see that mostly they're fairly similar, but the big differences are with Livermore and Oak Ridge, that they have a bigger proportion based on lines of code. So you can see that there's an effect there, and that's, I know James Simmons of Oak Ridge has been very busy deleting code, which might sound easy, but you obviously have to be very careful to make sure you're not throwing out anything important when you're removing the dead stuff. And so that accounts for a large portion of that work he's been doing. And Livermore, there's two big factors there, I think, that Chris Marone has been very busy trying to beat our build system into submission, and also Livermore have been running Sequoia in production on pre-release versions of 2.4, and often while they've been diagnosing the bugs, they have obviously a very strong technical team there. They've on many occasions found the bugs themselves and actually come up with a fix along with the bug report. So that's a chunk of that really is very significant improvements towards the 2.4 quality. And I did also want to call out people who are new names in the contribution list, along with all the usual suspects. So GSI. Thomas Steiber there has had some work come up from Kerberos-related changes. NASA as well, long-time users, but this is the first time I think I've noticed their name crop up in the list of people who've had a contribution in the list. S&C is actually Science and Computing, so they're an integrator based in Germany, and so they had noticed some areas that there were some mistakes in some scripts and passed up the fixes, so that's most welcome. That kind of, just making things easier, just if there is a mistake, if there's something like that bothers you, just let's get it fixed, right? So it should be so easy to do that. And SUSE as well is a very obviously prominent name to appear there. And so SUSE have actually been involved in a really cool collaboration between SUSE, Oak Ridge, NRL, and ourselves to support servers, accelerate the work to support servers on newer kernel versions, and with their particular interest, of course, being to re-enable the capability of having server support for SUSE on upcoming Lustre releases. And so, I think that's been an excellent example of community collaboration, because that has been, 4 organizations who've been, submitting patches, rebasing, exchanging notes, and, reviewing each other's patches. So that's, I think, and the results are there. I think we've got to the baseline now where it's possible to build a SUSE server, although, of course, then testing it and working out bugs and things would follow on before you could have feel very confident about using that in production, but it's certainly a really significant milestone. And now going on, I've put the lines of code onto a graph here. So now you can see, looking at the provisional data for 2.4 next to all the others, you can probably realize why I didn't add that into my older slide at the beginning, because it kind of dwarfs the earlier releases somewhat, and you would lose the, the key bit of information there that I was trying to illustrate. But seeing although 2.4 has like a huge amount of change, these change can be two factors in terms of new code. It can be modifications to code, or it can be old code deleted or even moved, reorganized. And so, but you can see that 180 branched from B18 branched from B16 just shortly around the 165 time frame, and so you can see 2.4 looks, although of course the clock is still ticking there, we look to be similar in terms of the amount of change that went into the 180 release, and whereas we've had much more modest amounts for the earlier feature releases. But I just thought that was a very interesting comparison, just to see where we are there. And so now for the latest on 2.4, so I do send out regular updates to the mailing lists with how things are going. We discuss every CWG meeting. We have discussions about the latest of people's testing and where things are at. And the blocker, the filter listed here, I do include this in my updates to the mailing lists. You can, that's open in Jira. You can have that on your dashboard or get email, subscribe to get email updates or anything if you're really interested in watching that more closely. And then I put in a placeholder for me just to give the latest update based, on, hot off the presses. And it's... so we have around 20 blockers now, so we're definitely behind where we ought to be to hit the target of being out at the end of this month. Most of those actually have a path to resolution in terms of a patch, and some are those that we don't are the ones that have just been discovered in the last day or two. So there's always a risk at this stage. There's a certain error bar around when you're working on a 6-month cycle, quite exactly to the day where you're going to fall is a hard call. But my feeling now from what I see here is that we are likely to slip into May, but probably only by 2 or 3 weeks or something. But obviously I'll keep updating via those channels to keep everyone up to date. And if you have a specific timeline or requirement, please just I'm happy to talk with you and see what we can do and give you the best information I have at that time to sort of help you with your decision making. So moving on to 2.5, again we've just started thinking about this, and we've sent out the initial call for features to the mailing lists, and we'll be discussing this in an upcoming CWG to decide what everyone feels the best test matrix, the best where to focus our testing for this release. One thing that I did want to particularly call out, I won't go into, basically Andreas Dilger will be going on to the post 2.4 releases in way more detail later today, I think, or certainly this conference. And but I did want to particularly mention HSM because that had initially been hoped to be in the 2.4 release, but unfortunately wasn't sufficiently ready in time. But we're CA confident that we ought to be able to have things ready for 2.5. So obviously we all hope that's right. I know that's a very eagerly anticipated feature. And finally, release quality. So this, Chris Gearing will be going into more detail about testing matters and quality, but I did want to just touch on this because I think this is very important, and I think our key thing has been our continuous testing has been a really big factor into meaning that the releases as they come out are far more stable than they ever have been. I mean, it's not a realistic goal to just have 0 bugs. But what you really, if you make that your goal, you'll never get a release out the door. But to make sure that you've covered like the most you can and have the highest quality release, and that all that's really out there is very obscure edge cases that are low impact, I think is a more reasonable goal. And that's by having continuous testing. We have testing with every tag, and there's a certain degree of testing done with every commit. And all these kind of things really help to mean that the code in master is as close to release quality as we can keep it at any time. And so it really is viable for people to, if you've got a new cluster you're installing and you're just putting it through its paces, download, the latest tag, even though it's not a release, and just run it. And if there's issues, open tickets. And then, by the time it turns into a real release, we've not had an opportunity to get those fixed. And so, I did also want to mention here a customer of ours, ETH Zurich, who, this isn't going to be to everyone's taste, but they have been running the 2.4 tags in production and moving along just as a way of, they have, I guess, more of a scratch sort of file system that they do this on, but they understand the risks, but they are able to sort of open up tickets if there are issues, and it does mean as a result that we're able to address those issues ahead of it being a GA release. And then the other thing I really wanted to focus on here was Hyperion as well. So I've mentioned this before, but really having the system of Hyperion and that sort of scale at our disposal for testing really makes a huge difference, because some issues you really just don't see and until you're running them at scale. And we've actually, so I always, been grateful for that, but since I've last presented to you, we've had some further improvements there. We've, firstly I wanted to sort of, the team there has been very flexible in terms of allowing us to keep Red Hat 5 partition around much longer than was convenient for them, so that we were able to continue to do scale testing for maintenance releases, which was much appreciated. And the other thing is they volunteered, because we had mentioned that occasionally, we have a certain allocation of, a couple of hundred nodes that we were using routinely, and then once in a while we would have these, we would get free use of the whole system. And we mentioned how useful these were to sort of, have more like 1,000 nodes for a few days. And so they offered to give us a week a month. So every month we have a week where we have free reign over Hyperion to just do what we like to it. And so that means that we can do not just, just standard benchmark testing, but also we can do specific feature testing at scale as well, which is often, really useful. And also, Livermore have shared with us a workload simulation system, which called SWL, synthetic workload, and basically it runs random amounts of random loading tools in varying amounts, and so it a bit more simulates a production environment than just running, one particular benchmarking tool for a long period. We actually have more variability, and we have, we got that quite late in 2.3, and that's in fact why 2.3 was a few weeks later than expected, because we got that for the first time, ran it, and discovered a couple of very serious bugs, but subtle bugs that we wouldn't have known about otherwise until things were released in production, and we're able to take the time to fix them. So that's been very useful going forward. So that's the end of my presentation. Do we have some questions, or I ran a little long?
Are there questions? We've got mic runners, so raise your hand if you've got one. And
I'm happy to take questions personally on breaks as well if anyone's feeling shy.
So Peter, I have a real simple question. So if you look at it's somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but if you look at 2.2, 2.3, and 2.4 and the number, right, it almost looks like an exponential curve. So what's in store for the next one?
Well, I hope it's more a cycle than an exponential growth, yes, or my nerves wouldn't take that, I don't think.
I'm all of a sudden having flashbacks from 3 years ago, Peter. where you're on the podium and I've got the microphone. So what I wanted to ask about is the HSM. Either I spaced or you didn't cover it. Can you talk about how HSM is being released, what versions, when?
Oh yeah, that I think you spaced, Brent. That's in 2.5. Okay.
Anybody else?
Okay. Oh, hi. Sure.
Yeah, hi, Peter. I heard you had mentioned that Xyratex will be releasing a 1.8.8 stream alongside what's already out there.
Well, yes, yeah.
How does that change the dynamic of, I guess, the Lustre path, if at all? Is it just a separate stream altogether? And that's
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the thing, is Oracle had been focusing purely on the needs of their customers, but without a view to considering 2x upgrades. So, you know, I think that's really, it's geared up for that small subset of customers that's come across, and, you know, I'll just defer to Xyratex to answer about what the implications are of that.
That's exactly right. We're contractually obligated to finish the 1.8.8 release that was started by Oracle, but our intention is not to continue. Our intention is not to continue on a separate side branch for continuing on 1.8.8 or 1.8x releases after that.
All right.
Okay. So I heard you talk about a call for features for the update of versions, but at my site I didn't receive any request for this new feature for upgrade. So I was wondering what are the mechanisms from which proposal arrive to the developers, or the developers sort of ask for proposal to the users.
So, I mean, to be clear, the call for features is not for suggestions for new features. It's for people who are working on new features, so developers. So that request went out on the HBDD Discuss and the CWG mailing lists. So that's where all the stuff relating to releases happens. So, yeah.
How do we broaden that out? Do we need to go to other mailing lists? Is there...
We could do, yeah. But, yeah.
Right. Thank you, Peter Jones.
Okay. Thank you.